Armed with a basic foundation in programming concepts, let's turn our attention to a look at the three pillars of JavaScript, the three main areas, units of discussion that you're really going to want to spend time digging into. And again, as I said at the outset of this course, expectation-wise, this is not like you can spend one day and be just totally done with any one of these three. These are weeks, months, potentially even years of time on each of them. And you're going to get them in layers. You're not going to have all of one and then all of another. It's going to be layer upon layer. So as you go throughout your development career and your JavaScript career in particular, you're going to see these kinds of things coming up over and over and over again. And my hope is that you'll be able to take this as a reference to come back to, and again the books as a reference to come back to as you see those layers being added on as you go throughout your career. So the three pillars of JavaScript we want to look at. Number one, we want to look at types and coercion. Number two, we want to look at the scope and the closure system. And number three, the this and the prototype system. And actually, that's more about class-oriented even than prototypes. So those are the three main areas that we will look at through the rest of this course. Let's dive into types and coercion. The three things that we want to look at underneath types and coercion are the primitive types. And if you remember from the primer at the top, we saw primitive types like number and Boolean and string. We want to get real clear on what those are. We want to talk about how you convert from one type to another, because basically all programs have to do some kind of conversion from one type to another. And then we want to check whether or not two values are equal or one value is less than. We want to do some sort of equality checking on our values. Those are the three main areas that we want to pay attention to. And I'll just give you a word of caution. This particular unit, out of the three, this particular unit is generally speaking one of the lesser focused on things as most people learn about JavaScript. And I think it might be one of the more important of the foundational pillars for this language. So it's really important that you push against that normal temptation. Someone may tell you, oh, you don't need to know about that stuff, just do it this way. I think it's important to push against that and really dig in here and understand these are core mechanisms to the language, and it's not going to be effective for you in your career if you're writing JavaScript and you have no idea how it's working or what it's doing. So let's dive into types and coercion. We'll look at primitive types. Again, we said at the outset what those are, but just as a quick kind of review, we want to look at the strings and Booleans. And I want to confront head-on this statement that is thrown around. You'll find this in books and blogs, and you may have run across this on a Stack Overflow answer or 500 at some point or another. Somebody will say something like, in JavaScript, everything is an object. That is thrown around as a fact, and it is 100% false. It is not true that in JavaScript everything is an object. There are historical reasons why people think that, but it really is not actually true. We do have, indeed, primitive types. So let's look at what some of those are. You might recall that we talked about undefined. Well, we also have the string type. We have the number type, the Boolean type, the object type. Those five are pretty solid, pretty well easy to understand. But we have a couple that might surprise you. So we have symbol, which was a brand new one that was added about 2 or 3 years ago. It doesn't get a lot of usage, but it is one of the primitive types in JavaScript. So every once in a while you might run across a symbol. But what also about null? You remember undefined was an empty type. What about null? Well, that is a primitive type, but I have it highlighted in orange because it behaves a little bit strangely with respect to the type of operator. It gives us not back what we would expect. So it's an important type, but it has some quirks that we have to be aware of. And then also function. We know functions are a thing in our language, but is it really a primitive type? Technically, it's not. It's actually technically just a subtype of the object type, which is the same as true for arrays. Arrays are not their own official primitive type. They are a subtype of the object type. So let's just point out that the types that we're talking about are associated with the values themselves, not with the variables. So in some programming languages, like for example Java or C, you say variable x is going to hold integers, and then it can only ever hold integers. And then you say variable y, and it can only ever hold, Boolean or something like that. Well, That's different in scripting language. In a dynamically typed language like we have with JavaScript, it's different because here we're not talking about X or Y having a type. Here we're talking about the values themselves having a type. So that it's not the variables that have types, it's the values. So when I say var v, you might recall when we declare a variable that it initially gets assigned the undefined value, and the undefined value is going to have type of, quote, undefined. If I assign it a string 1 and then I say type of v, I'm going to get, quote, string. And then if I assign it the number 2 and I say type of, it's, quote, number. And so on. For Boolean, we see the object giving us, quote, object. There's one of those ES6 symbols giving us, quote, symbol. I want to highlight the undefined for just a moment because this one's a little bit bizarre. It's been declared and it's been given undefined, but there's another case where we can get the same return result of, quote, undefined, and that is when the variable has never been declared. You might think that should give a different result. I certainly do. But it turns out that in either the case where it's been declared and has no value, or it's never been declared, JavaScript sort of treats those both as the undefined state. And that can actually lead to some confusion later on, so it's good to be aware of that. Here's an example. When we say type of doesn't exist, there's a variable that doesn't exist, and yet we're still getting the, quote, undefined. We haven't created it with a var statement, and yet we're still getting, quote, undefined. So again, be aware of the difference between a variable that's been created and has no value, like the previous one, like v in the previous slide, but also variables that you reference. And you don't often reference variables that are straight up never exist, but you maybe mistype a variable name. And that will be in that state where the type of operator would give us, quote, undefined. I mentioned just a moment ago that null kind of behaves a little bit strange. We see here that type of v, when the value is null, we see that it gives us, quote, object, instead of what we might expect of, quote, null. This is an historical bug from JavaScript. There's not really anything we can do about those bugs. We can't fix those things because it would break far too many pieces of code. And then we see if we assign it a function to the v variable, that's called a function expression, by the way, and we'll talk about that later in the course. Type of v there, we get, quote, function. And even though function is not an actual primitive type, it's a subtype of object, as I said, it does have its own unique return value here, which might be a little bit surprising, but it's actually very useful because we need to know if we have a value that can be called as a function. And then we see line 9, we create an array, and type of is going to give us, quote, object here, because it can't further distinguish that as a subtype of the object there. You might think, why did it do it for functions and not for arrays? And the answer, as with most things, is because reasons, because history. There's a variety of different reasons why these quirks exist. Can't really change them now because there's so much JavaScript that would break. But again, we can further distinguish things that are arrays using other built-in methods, like, for example, array.isArray. And we'll talk about those sorts of operations as we go forward.